So hello, everyone. My name is Mirsad Kriještorac, and I'm a senior researcher at Bratislava-based Minority Issues Research Institute, known by its MIRI acronym. Our MIRI is dedicated on working towards education, promoting and protecting human and minority rights in Slovakia and abroad. As part of our activities, we hold monthly conversations with experts and people around the world about important affairs and issues significantly affecting societies and minorities as our effort to educate and empower general public. To repeat the usual code of conduct for our events, we are going to first hear from our guest scholar, and after that, we'll open the discussion for the questions and answers. At that point, if you want to ask a question in person, please indicate in the chat and we'll call upon you. Once your microphone is on, please introduce yourself, tell us where you're joining us from, and then ask your question. You're also welcome to type in your question in a chat box if you prefer to ask like that. Today, we are to talk with Dr. Marvin Dunn about American history, with particular focus on Black resistors and efforts to undermine and defame them during their lives and even after they passed away. As historians began reporting on the important roles of many of those people in the US national history, the subject became controversial and political powers acted openly to limit the expression and teaching of it, reminding us one more time that the exercise of power is most visible in terms of what we are not allowed to know and what we don't know as a result of such power dynamics. During the recent period of openness with new American history approach, we began to uncover and teach history of various minorities in the United States. But soon after, perhaps because of that openness, history became a controversial subject in schools and universities, and it was even debated in political campaigns. So now, to try to better understand that history, MIRI invited Dr. Marvin Dunn to discuss the suppression and distortions about African-American history and its significant people who were speaking truth to power. The discussion today will center around the intentional defamation of Black resistors in American history, with focus upon H. Rap Brown and Muhammad Ali in particular. Dr. Marvin Dunn, a native Floridian, is a professor emeritus and retired chairperson of the Department of Psychology at Florida International University in Miami, Florida. Born during the Jim Crow era of legally required segregation, he actively works to bring forward a perspective of Black history that has been missed, distorted, and minimized in the past. He co-authored the 1984 book, The Miami Riots of 1980, Crossing the Bounds. He also authored 1997 book, Black Miami in the 20th Century, as well as 2016 book, A History of Florida Through Black Eyes, and finally the 2022 book, The Kingsley. He recently also published a new book, and probably he'll mention it during his presentation, about African-American history of Florida for a middle school, which is an interesting project. Dr. Dunn is the founder and executive director of the Miami Center for Racial Justice, a nonprofit organization created to tell and preserve the true and accurate Black history of Florida, especially these stories that are difficult to hear. There are various activities by which Dr. Dunn is now well known in the United States, and make sure to visit his website, dunnhistory.com, to find out more about all his activities and his works. Dr. Dunn, it's now your turn.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I apologize for all the technical difficulties that we have had coming on. I have been looking forward to this conversation. I grew up in Florida. I was born in 1940. I have a long view of history in this country and in Florida. And I began my interest in Black history some 40 years ago. And my interest in Black history has evolved to particularly my focus on anti-Black violence and lynching and what have you in Florida. But over the years, I have also developed interest in resistance, Black resistance over the years, looking at how history has taught, and treated Black folks who have resisted the status quo.
Dr. Dunn, if I can interrupt you for a second,
yes.
If you can put the microphone slightly closer so we can hear you better, that would be great.
Is this better?
Excellent.
Oh, okay. So my study in history has evolved to studying particularly anti-Black violence, resistance to the status quo, etc. And I have focused especially on Blacks who have offered active resistance to the status quo, including Blacks who were active in that process in the 1960s and beyond. But actually, if we look at what has happened to the Black people, particularly Black men in our history who have stood up against the status quo, I have found that those who have been Muslims have been the most ill-treated, have been the most denigrated, and also the most threatened. And we have a number of examples of that in Black history, in American history, with H. Rap Brown, Muhammad Ali, and Marcus Garvey, and others that I could mention. So I think the question is, why is it that there has been such resistance to Black men who stood up, as opposed to those who have been much more accommodating to the status quo, such as Martin Luther King and others? And I think a lot of that has to do with religious persecution in our country that goes way back to the arrival of the first Africans in America. We recognize that 30% of the Africans who were enslaved in this country were Muslims. And from the very beginning of their arrival on these shores, there's been a tendency to suppress the religion, suppress their voices. And this is just more recently good examples of that. Did you have a particular question I could respond to? Now I can't hear you.
As I said, we're hoping that you're going to enlighten us a little bit more about the whole movement, because there is a lot of international audience here that is maybe not as familiar with American history in general, and the particular problem in particular, and then we will open the questions and answers.
All right. Well, let's talk about in terms of the civil rights movement, if we want to focus on that and how that period relates to what we're talking about. In the 1960s, a number of Black organizations were actively trying to change the status quo in our country. This involved demonstrations and all kinds of activities to advance Black interests, voting rights activities, etc., demonstrations. And over the course of our history, there's been resistance to that, of course, particularly in the 1960s, and particularly as we have had Blacks who have emerged to try to resist the status quo, as I said a moment ago. What about the movement should I speak to? I wanted to mention particularly what has happened, what did happen to H. Rap Brown, and what happened to Muhammad Ali once they became visibly active in the movement. Maybe I should speak to Muhammad Ali. He's a better known figure. He was a man who emerged as a very successful athlete, became a heavyweight champion of the world, and then announced himself to be a member of the Nation of Islam. And his life became miserable after that. Why? Because he was now a national figure, international figure with great status, and here he was proclaiming himself to be a member of the Islamic faith. That brought down a lot of trouble on him, as it did, as I said a moment ago, H. Rap Brown and others, even going back beyond that particular era. So what has happened, a lot of these men were imprisoned, as happened with H. Rap Brown and others. Some were killed as a result of their active resistance, as Black Panthers, as some of them were called. So I'm just trying to make the point to our audience that Black resistance, particularly resistance by Black men who were of the Muslim faith, has been most vigorously opposed in our society. And I'm trying to reach back to explain that that has happened since the very first arrival of enslaved Black people on this in this country.
Yeah, that's great. Dr. Dunn, can you also like clarify a little bit, or rather enlighten us about the times when those two, I mean, because somewhat there were Black resistors, and Muhammad Ali was most famously known for resisting to go and serve in the military. And now we are entering the new phase of this, how you say, interventions and wars and stuff. And so it's good for us to recall like these times and those particular acts of resistance and how they were expressed and how they were received by the general public at that time.
Well, I think even many Black people were amazed and unhappy that Muhammad Ali emerged as a Muslim. Many African Americans looked up to him as Cassius Clay before he claimed himself to be a member of the Islamic faith. When he came out and announced himself, there was horror, particularly in the white community. Now they have this man of international fame who was a Muslim. And a lot of, I think, as I mentioned a moment ago, many African Americans were surprised and disappointed as well. Keep in mind that most African Americans belong to the Baptist and Methodist faith. Most of us, I think, came up out of that tradition. So when Ali made his announcement, yes, it was universally received in the Black community. And I think that he recognized that, and his family, in a sense, paid the price for that, even among African Americans.
Yeah, and you know, many people don't know the story of H. Rob Brown, even though he's perhaps a towering figure. Maybe like I would not exaggerate if I compare him to Malcolm X and Muhammad Ali and others. So why is that people, first of all, maybe a little bit more about H. Rob Brown, who he was, and then why do you think there is so much of lack of knowledge about H. Rob Brown, who recently passed away and is buried there?
Right. Yes, he emerged as a member of the so-called Black Panther movement, which evolved in California, and they were very resistant to police abuse. The organization did a lot towards Black empowerment and uplifting the Black community. They opened schools, they served meals, they mentored children, they went into prisons and spread the faith and saved a lot of people. And their philosophy was active resistance to violence. So the ultimate expression of that was freedom by any means necessary, resist by any means necessary when you are attacked or abused. So that kind of attitude, that kind of approach was very, very unusual, very contrary to Martin Luther King Jr. and his method of nonviolence resistance. So we had people in California like H. Rob Brown who was saying, go out and resist the police abuse. They were walking the streets armed because it was legal to be armed at the time in California, and that was resisted as well. You had these Black men dressed in black, walking the streets, protecting Black people from the police, and therefore they attracted a lot of attention, particularly from the federal government, the FBI, etc. So they were taped, they were followed, they were videotaped, they were audio taped, they were prosecuted legally, and eventually, in the case of H. Rob Brown, arrested on a trumped-up charge that never was proven. They killed a police officer when actually done by someone else. And of course, the police trying to spend all of his life after he was convicted in prison, died in prison, an innocent man, even though someone else admitted that he had committed the crime. Because of who H. Rob Brown was, and particularly because he was a Muslim, they made sure that he stayed in prison and died in prison, an old man. One of the most, I think, egregious examples of abuse in American judicial history.
Yeah. So like you become very well known now throughout the United States, but particularly in South Florida, because of your unorthodox classes of history, of Black history, at the university, where you are essentially doing open public
Yeah.
education, right? Teaching history
Yes.
to young people, the history that is essentially not being allowed to be taught in the classrooms, right? And so
Yes.
what is interesting about that, not only that you're doing that, but you actually do remember this type of stuff. You know, I don't want to reveal your age, Dr. Dunn, but you're old enough to to actually see this, witness this. So it's not a matter of something you read and now you're telling others what you read about, but you are actually um, that you are actually experiencing that. So I was just to ask you also, because we have here a lot of students who are essentially studying minority rights in Slovakia and other places, right? And so, you know, maybe you can kind of enlighten them why you're doing that. Why do you teach history publicly? Like you come, you sit in a public space and talk to young people about it. What is the purpose of it, and how that fits to this story that you just spoke about, these Black resistors?
Well, in more recent years, particularly in Florida, there has been an attempt by the government to suppress the teaching of Black history. Certain kinds of concepts can't even be mentioned in a Florida university classroom, such as institutional racism. Books have been banned that deal with racism and racial equality in our society. So that suppression of ideas has led to a chilling effect on the teaching of our history, particularly on the teaching of Black history that is uncomfortable for a lot of people to hear and to experience. So what I did was I selected a tree on the campus of my university where I taught for 35 years and started offering lectures in psychology and history to anyone who wanted to sit and listen. The university, I didn't ask permission to do this. I just started doing it, and people came. And we have had guests to come in and talk about these issues. And I think it's important to do it because we need to show that we will not simply accept the suppression of the teaching of our history. We will actively resist it in any way that we can, and that's why I do that. And so far, even though the police watch us, they have basically not disturbed our activities. But anytime you have the kind of suppression of the truth, as we now have in Florida and in our country, we have to have those of us, particularly who have been around for a while, to stand up and resist in nonviolent ways to make sure that our stories are heard.
Mm. So teaching history as a point of resistance, which is kind of quite amazing to what extent we have what moment in history we live in, right? That even teaching of a history is now a controversial issue, right? It's act of resistance. So how do people?
And may I just also add, just in terms of my personal involvement in what's happening, I have a daughter who is Jewish, I have a daughter who's Christian, and I have a daughter who's Muslim. My grandchildren of my daughter who is Christian can get a voucher from the state of Florida to attend a Christian school. My grandchildren of my daughter who's Jewish can get a voucher to go to a Jewish school. My grandchildren of my daughter who is Muslim could not get a voucher from the state of Florida to attend an Islamic school in the state of Florida. That's incredibly cruel in my view, but it also reflects what I think has been part of the problem I've been trying to address as we've had this conversation.
Yeah. So yeah, oftentimes the health of democracy can be measured by the treatment of minorities. That's why we're doing this. That's why we started our Minority Issues Research Institute, to essentially point to that, to that aspect where the majority has to understand that the health of democracy is essentially measured by the treatment of minorities.
And a part of what I do today is I take students, university students, to places in Florida where some of the worst racial violence took place. And we go to these places with the particular point of having the students experience directly the space in which these things have happened. So have been doing this now for 3 years. We've taken thousands of students and faculty members all over the state of Florida to reteach those stories that are being actively suppressed in our history today. We have, as a matter of fact, we do that because I got through my nonprofit organization, a grant from the Mellon Foundation for money to pay the expenses to take students to have these experiences that we share with them.
Yeah, that's that Miami Center for Racial Justice, right?
Yes, yes. The Mellon Foundation has been very generous in helping us to be able to take people to places in Florida where these things have happened.
So what happens when you take students to these places and they see it? And I'm talking about students in general, whether they are part of the majority, whatever the majority means,
Yes.
they're part of the minority, whatever the minority means, how they respond to these whatever encounters with what happened in the past.
The groups are racially mixed. Frankly, what happens is that some of them cry. I take them to the grave of a 15-year-old black boy who was lynched in Florida in 1944 for writing a love letter to a white girl. And some of these students are barely 2 or 3 years older than this boy. And I tell his story. And we pray, we hold hands, and then in the evenings, we share our feelings and thoughts about what happened, what we experienced. And what I try to do is to have people experience these things without anger or guilt or pointing the finger or anything like that, but to simply say we experienced this together. It was sad. It's uplifting in the sense that we're trying to make sure we sustain this history through our own telling of it. But basically, it's both sad, but also uplifting and reassuring that at least these stories will live through young people going to these places and then sharing these stories on their own social media and with their own families. That's how these suppressed stories, like what happened to H. Rat Brown and what happened to Muhammad Ali and others, get shared through our history.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, so that's quite moving. Yeah, I have experienced similar things with my students sometimes when they learn something that is of importance to them, they have some strong reaction. So you as a psychologist, like, okay, so why is history so controversial, Dr. Dunn? Why there's such high level discussions about it. The one of the most boring classes in college are history classes, right? All of a sudden, that becomes the most controversial subject. What happened?
Because it's so violent. Because it is so violent. American history is a history of violence. I spent 7 years defending my country. I'm a good American. I love my country, but we have a violent history. From the very first arrival of white people in Western America, we have a violent history. What we did to the indigenous people, to the Native American people, the land that I say we, speaking as American, the things we did were just wrong, violent, and a lot of people want to walk away from those things. Why revisit all that violence against the Native Americans? Why revisit what was done to the Japanese Americans during the Second World War when they were interred in prison just because they were Japanese? So a lot of the history is violent. A lot of folks now want us to get over it. Why are you still talking about lynching? Why are you still talking about segregation? But that's part of the reason for it. It's difficult for folks to confront some of the things of the past, particularly when you try to look at what happened in the past and try to relate that to what's happening in our world today. I'll give you one example. In 1842, the federal government Florida was just becoming a state, and the federal government gave white men in Florida who were heads of household 6 acres of land free if they were just farming. But no black male head of household got that land back in those days. Think about how that impacts Black and white wealth today, comparatively speaking. So I try to show folks how the ills of the past translate into the present, particularly when it comes down to the accumulation of wealth, education, etc.
Yeah. So you reminded me of what H. Rob Brown have said, like that violence is American as cherry pie, right? Famous statement he made, right? But yeah, and then also it's good to point to this, generational poverty, generational wealth issues.
And a lot of it goes back to land, because throughout American history, particularly throughout Southern history, there have been legal restraints to Black people having access to land ownership. And that's traceable all the way back to the last couple of 300 years in our country's history. We have not been allowed to own land. Even today in Miami, Florida, where I live, even today in Miami, 90% of the Black folks do not own land. They rent rather than own their own homes. And that translates into a lot of difficulties that people experience when you don't own your own land where you live.
Yeah, and it is particularly telling when they turn around and start blaming minorities for being poor.
or not trying enough, or pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. But what about if you don't have any boots? But what we hear, particularly here in South Florida, with a lot of immigrants coming into the community, folks who have no connection to our history, even folks coming in, Black people coming in from the Caribbean, from Haiti, do not understand African American suffering in history. They come from a totally different cultural and historical experience. So African Americans particularly feel isolated, even within the Black community. African Americans are becoming a minority within a minority, where our own history has not been appreciated, even among our own racial group.
Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah. But I'm pointing to this because I hear from my colleagues that that's how students in Europe consider some minorities there. They will talk about, for example, Roma people in Europe and look at them, living in poverty and blaming them for being poor, forgetting that they were enslaved just like African Americans were. And in fact, their slavery lasted 100 years longer than African American slavery. And of course, these people cannot really pull themselves up in a generation or two or three while they are being continuously, suppressed and oppressed.
No, any place on earth where being Black is not a problem except in Africa. I mean, in every place that we have now been spread out to, being Black is a problem, except on the continent of Africa, thank goodness.
Yeah, well, yeah, and that's why teaching of this history is important so that we have a better understanding of these present realities.
And see, one of the shortcomings of the American Civil Rights Movement, which was based upon the nonviolent philosophy of Dr. King, was that it didn't go far enough. That's why we needed H. Rap Brown and others, the Black Panthers, to come in and show the fact that even though civil rights had been legally protected or established, Blacks in urban areas were not making progress economically, that the civil rights movement did not touch urban Black America. And that's why these leaders emerged as being very important, and why folks who lived in cities responded more to the messages coming from H. Rap Brown and the Black Panthers and others than they did to those who had followed Dr. King.
Right, right. So, I have two questions now. Like, first will be, like, you actually met some of these people personally, because you came to Miami and stuff. And maybe you can share something about that. And then also I would like to ask you maybe after that a follow-up question.
I heard Malcolm X speak once. I was 17 years old. I was in college in Atlanta at Morehouse College, and he was just emerging as a national figure. He was at that time an upcoming minister in New York. And our custodian was a member of the Nation of Islam and asked some of us freshmen to go to the mosque to hear this young minister coming out of New York. I never experienced anything like that. I'd never been to a mosque before. So I go in, and the women on one side, men on the other side, very unusual for me. And then men standing up front with, they weren't guns, they were staffs, but very clearly they were bodyguards. They were there to present a formidable opposition anybody might want to rush the stage. Standing room only. And Malcolm X took the stage by himself. Actually, with no introduction, just walked out and started talking. I never heard him speak like that. I never heard him. I had just come out of Miami, Florida, Central Florida. I never heard anyone say, America does not deserve us. that why do you want to be with the white man? What has the white man done for you? Why would a black man ever want to be with a white woman? He just went on and on. And I'm sitting there aghast. And then he took the American flag and threw it on the ground. And a lot of what he said that night was outright racist, to tell you the truth. All white people have a tail, he said, at the bottom of the spine. They all have a tail from when they were in the trees as monkeys. Black folks don't have that, but white people do. I said, well, come on now, Malcolm. You're stretching a little bit there. But I was in a sense frightened by his rhetoric, which was so strong at that point because he was just now becoming well known. As you know, he went to Mecca and he moderated his feelings about race and came back much more accepting of Muslims as a people rather than just as blacks. But wow, did I have an eye-opening experience that night. 2 weeks later, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. came to Morehouse to speak to us. In fact, he came 3 times when I was there. Boring. I can't tell you one thing he said. I think I remember most of what Malcolm said. King was just boring. He wasn't even that well known at that time. It was before the Montgomery bus boycott. His Daddy King, who was the pastor of the biggest black church in Atlanta, we all knew him. When Daddy King came to speak to Morehouse, we sat up and paid attention. But he was not all that exciting as I think back upon it. Just as I think back, the other recollection I have of some pain is when Malcolm was killed.
Muhammad Ali, he came to Miami too.
I never met him. I never met him personally, so I can't say that. But I just wanted to reflect for a moment on what happened in my own heart when Malcolm was killed. I was still in the Navy, just about to get out of the Navy, and that news came down. And because I now knew who he was, how he had evolved, and I was beginning to appreciate in great measure his message that the civil rights movement had failed urban black America. And then this happens to him. And it appears to have been done by other black people. And I was just crestfallen. I still have pain from that we lost him so young, and how it might have been different for all of us had he survived. How it might have been different had H. Rap Brown not have been imprisoned and made to die, that old man in prison. Had those voices been heard decades later, we may be in a better place as a country today.
Yeah, that was my second follow-up question. Like, where do you think we're going with this? Right? We all know that the genie's out of the bottle. There is no way for this history to be suppressed anymore. But these efforts are serious and real, and especially in schools and universities, as you know, there is like a very subtle, how you say, apprehension about what you're going to say in the classroom and stuff. So where are we heading? Where are we going with this whole approach?
Right now, I'm very concerned about what's happening among young white men in the conservative movement in our country. There was a racist chat that emerged on the Florida National University campus just a few weeks ago, where young white men were passing on messages of violence towards black people. It's now being investigated by the university. But what I see happening at a very, very now more apparent level is anger coming from young white men about losing their country. That America's going brown and black, all these immigrants coming in, not to mention, as they said, these terrorists, the Islamic terrorists coming into the country. So there's a movement today among some white men of the conservative bent to speak out, even to act out against minorities. And when you hear and see that happening on university campuses, as we just saw and hear what happened at FIU, that's serious, particularly when it seems to be at some level condoned by a major political party. So I'm worried about where we're going with this. The good news that I think is that our country is waking up to a lot of this. I think we're going to see major political changes with the upcoming midterm elections. I think that the country realizes that we've swung way too far to the right. And what I see now is independence, the folks in the middle shifting back towards a more reasonable political stance and interpretation of where we are and what we need to be doing as a country. We're moving back towards a more moral society. I'm very concerned about where we are right now, but I think we're moving back into the right direction. I think that will become apparent in the midterm elections.
So you just think that this was an episode where basically response to that openness that we had for the past, maybe,
Not an episode. I think it's been there all along. I think that there is a political climate today in Washington and certainly in Tallahassee that makes it seem okay to become more visible and more heard in terms of these views. So no, we had this go. You could trace this same sense of losing our country to minorities and the need to keep the immigrants out. This predates Trump. It goes back, generations, particularly in the conservative political sphere in our country. It just became more visible since Trump has become president and since DeSantis became governor here in Florida.
Yeah. Okay. So, but you believe in that steady progress, that things will get better, right?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, I'm over 80 years old, so I've seen how bad it was. I'm a child of Jim Crow. I had to sit in the back of the bus, walk past white people to get to the back of the bus. I still, today, can tell you how that felt. I couldn't go to school with white kids when I was coming up. Could not attend white movie theaters. My mom had to go to the back door when she entered white people's homes. So my dad could not join the union until the 1950s. Think of the impact of that on economic empowerment for Black people when Black men were not allowed to join labor unions until the 1960s in this country. So when people say, well, it's as bad as it ever was, but no, it's not. If you have a longer view of history, you might be able to see that we have made progress, even though we've had periods when we seem to slip back, like during the McCarthy era back in the 50s, but we keep making, I think, progress towards becoming a more moral society and a more moral country. I have that faith in my country.
Yeah, you said I can tell you how it feels. So tell us how it feels. How it feels to be sit in the back of the bus. How it feels, but again, why? Because many of our listeners and many of the people joining today are part of the majority. So it's hard for them to essentially empathize with those who are in the minority. So how does it feel?
I was 6 or 7 years old with my mom and my brothers. My mom would board a bus in Miami or in DeLand, Florida, where I grew up. We did that because there was nothing else to do in the 1940s. There was no television. Very few people even had radio. So we would get on the bus just to ride the bus for entertainment. My mom would just do that on a Saturday evening. But she would take our hand, walk past the white people to the back of the bus, and then she would relax and we would sit down. I noticed that her tension seemed to ease when we got to our area of the bus. But as I was doing that, each time that I did it, my feeling was, I'm not good enough to sit up front with these white people. I'm not good enough. And then that was reinforced in every aspect of my life. I'm not good enough to go to a school with white children. I'm not good enough to go into a white movie theater. I'm not good enough to sit down at a lunch counter and have a meal. My father refused to go to the back door to get food at a restaurant because we weren't allowed to go inside and sit down. He wouldn't do that. He refused to subject us to a lot of the cruelty of that era. We were migrant workers. We would travel from Florida to New York every summer to pick vegetables and come back in the fall. And my dad would drive us in his car. It was an old car, but he would drive us. And there were no restaurants where you could eat without being made to go and get the food at a back door. You couldn't use restrooms. So that was very what's the right word? Dehumanizing. To, run the road for 2 or 3 days or no interstate. So it took 2 or 3 days to get from Florida to New York. And to using a toilet, we just put over the side of the road. And, my 5 brothers and my dad, and I would jump out, but my mom had to do that. That hurts me to this day that my mother had to do that. Okay, we guys did it, but those kinds of things, you never really get past those. What I think is important, though, is to not be angry at people today because of what happened to me and folks of my generation 60 or 70 years ago. White folks today didn't do that. They don't even know about it. That's why I'm glad you asked for those stories, because not that many of us are still left who could talk as given firsthand experience of having lived the life of Jim Crow. But to not be angry about it, I can't escape the sadness, frankly. And then I'm even more compelled to try to understand why that happened, why we were treated that way, and to do as much as I can to share the history, personal and otherwise, so that current people, particularly students, can appreciate how that history evolved and how it impacted us.
Okay, yeah, when you say that, then then the words that you said, the Malcolm X said, and the things that H. Rob Brown said, actually now make sense, right? Because of what you just described. So when somebody like them come and speak to the people who were being beaten up, their whole lives, and as we said, that as a Jim Crow era. A lot of students don't know there was essentially era where people were legally required to segregate. So it's not like a matter of, in other words, if I allow you to come into my restaurant on the front door, I may be arrested. So I was forced to demand that you go to the back door. And so then the stories of Malcolm X, the stories of Muhammad Ali, the stories of H. Rob Brown actually, resonate. But Dr. Dunn, young people, even young African Americans today, don't know this feeling.
Thank God they don't know the feeling, but they should know the stories. They should know how it did feel for those of us who can tell them. But I was thinking when you were talking about Malcolm just a moment ago and his philosophy. My grandmother, who's a very strong woman. She didn't really take any stuff off anybody, but her message to us as little boys growing up was: be courteous to everybody, respect everyone, don't hurt anyone, but if somebody puts their hands on you, send them to the cemetery. And that's what Malcolm said that night when I heard him speak. Respect everyone. Be nice to everybody. If somebody puts his hands on you, send them to the cemetery. That comes back to me as clear as if I was hearing him say it today. But my grandmother had the same view. Don't bother anybody, but if they touch you, send them to the cemetery. So it's amazing how that connection was just made in my mind. But yeah, my grandmother's philosophy of self-respect and self-protection was the same as Malcolm's.
Yeah, okay, that's also a part of why I ask, because people say, "Oh, these people are violent and stuff." They're not. They are just responding to, generations and generation of continuous violence that are directed over them in various ways. Sometimes it's overt, sometimes it's direct. And so how do you respond to that? Yeah, that's a big question. Now I will ask and invite everybody to ask their questions and speak directly to Dr. Dunn. We are honored to have him here today with us, and please feel free to join. But before that, I would like to introduce our Dr. Camilo Antonio. He is with us, patiently listening. I see it, right? He's the founder of Urban Nomad Mixes. He's poet, performer, scientist, longtime employee of the United Nations. He's connected with Vienna Poetry School for many years through performances, joint projects, and participation in various classes. He lives in Vienna. He's joining us from Austria, and I think he has a gift for us for today. And Dr. Camilo, before people start engaging with Dr. Dunn, you want to kind of speak?
Yes, well, thank you very, very much. I was very touched by what Dr. Dunn said, particularly in saying that episode of I'm Not Good Enough. I have a reverse story of not being good enough. I was in South Africa in 1982 for the United Nations Industrial Development Project. I was on what they called a World Congress for Agricultural and an agricultural mission. And the South African soldiers attacked a hotel in Maseru, where I was staying with a group with a team of 7 from the United Nations. I could have been killed because I was actually supposed to have been, I was supposed to have lodged in that hotel where the massacre took place. But at the last minute, I was asked to please join the whole team at the Sheraton, which was up the hill. And from up the hill, I saw the South African soldiers coming down with their helicopters and invading those rooms. I'm glad to be here and to tell this story that when I went out of immigration, where we were also held up, and that's another story. That's because Sorry?
So somebody will turn the microphone on.
Okay. Well, what I wanted to say is that I wanted to go to the WC, to the toilet, because we were detained for 3 hours by immigration, just because our American member of the team, the only woman in the team, by the way, told immigration that we were from the United Nations. And the day before, the United Nations condemned the position of South Africa. So they detained us for 3 hours. When I finally had the chance to go to the toilet, I was going for blacks, for coloreds only. A police officer came after me and said, "No, sir, you may not go in there." And I said, "So where should I go in?" And he said, "Follow me, please." He took me to a place which said, "For whites only." And I said, "I'm not white. I'm clearly colored." And he said, "No, sir, this is for Japanese. Are you not Japanese?" And I said, "No, I'm not Japanese." And I appreciate not only what you said about saying, well, we're not good enough for many things, because I went to the United States on a Rotary Fellowship in 1967. So I studied in Washington, D.C. I went to Georgetown, and during that time, I participated in civil rights movements. So I know what you are talking about. I'm just a few years younger than you, Dr. Dunn. But I would like to also mention that I've seen a lot of these deprivations. 2 weeks ago, I spoke for South African women in a project in which I learned that they still were having difficulties having access to lands. And this in a project where they were supposed to be looking at how they could be producers from natural oils and vegetable products. And I think this morning when I was looking at my schedule and I saw MIRI was on, I asked myself, well, what should I be saying from what a historian, a psychologist, an emeritus is going to say? And I thought then that I would perhaps just succinctly come up with a cycle of what I call my spurts of poems. I came up with what I call a cycle of heroic poetics in a circular loop. And I have this as a graphic, which I cannot show you now, but I'll start where it says, well, come into the sights of MIRI, sights meaning S-I-T-E-S there. Share sights, sights S-I-G-H-T-S here. Share sights that are far off, beyond the claims of fair play, as trumpets blare in minor hissing tones. From views with diverse, marginalized, and queer lenses, we will tell you how it feels being trampled on as if human rights and dignified lives of civil communities belong to only minorities at the top, the super rich, now entangled with terrorizing autocrats who carry on with their big wars to bloaten their coffers from invisible currencies that they exchange unconscionably. Thank you.
You're worse than I am.
Thank you, Dr. Camilo.
Yeah, I should be following you. Thank you for that. May I share? I appreciate that. Thank you so much. Let me share with you my experience in South Africa some years ago. The American government sent me.
He's frozen.
The Department of State sent me to South Africa. The concern was that South African high school kids and junior high school kids were armed in school, and they wouldn't put their guns down. They were not appreciative of their apartheid teachers, so they wanted me to go in because I had done some work with rioting in Miami. So the government sends me to South Africa, and they took me around to Soweto and other places to meet with these youth gangs, to talk with them about disarming. And at one meeting, someone said to me, well, Dr. Dunn, you don't understand because you're white. I said, what'd you say? So you're white, so you don't understand what we're going through. I said, why are you saying I'm white? They said, well, you have a PhD, you're being driven around in a limousine by the government, you have money. So in South Africa, that makes you white. Your skin color doesn't count. I was just, I had never been called a white person before, and nor have I been after. But isn't it a weird way to determine race based upon your wealth, your perceived wealth at that?
Yeah. So that's great. Great reflections, right? And as Dr. Camilo was talking about, his experience as a United Nations worker in South Africa, it reminded me how in New York, this legally required segregation was paused precisely because United Nations were essentially based in New York, and many of the United Nations diplomats who were there, they couldn't really ride in a separate buses and stuff. So the New Yorks decided basically to pause the legally required segregation so that they can accommodate all these diplomats. But also there is an undertone that I would like Dr. Dunn to you elaborate. I mean, you can certainly comment on this, and we have obviously some people who want to ask your questions. That aspect of human rights. When you mention Malcolm X, you mention Muhammad Ali, H.R. Brown, they were not civil rights leaders. They were human rights leaders. And that's also often forgotten part of that American Muslim contribution to the story of fighting for justice and fighting for equality in the United States.
Actually, I'm glad you made that distinction. Because civil rights legally have been attained in our country. The courts have spoken about civil rights, but human rights, the right to health care, the right to housing, the right to education, those rights have not been assured to anybody by any legal mechanisms of the government. So as you reflect upon, as I reflect upon what happened with the H. Rep. Browns and Malcolm X's and Marcus Garveys of our country, they were pressing for human rights. You're very correct to focus on that point. And those human rights are still unattained in our country and a lot of other places in the world, for that matter.
Yeah, you were to comment on the diplomats of United Nations in New York.
Yes. Back in the Jim Crow era, there was one hotel in Miami that allowed Black people to check in. Only one, and that was at the Miami International Airport. And the reason for that was because there were diplomats coming into Miami who needed a place to stay, and they were not allowed to stay in white hotels in Miami. So they had the option to staying at the the hotel at the Miami International Airport, and only because of the presence of Black diplomats needing a place to stay in Miami. Eventually, of course, hotels opened up, but for some 20 years, it was just the Miami International Airport hotel that would accept Blacks.
Yeah. That dimension of the story is sometimes also somewhat less known. That diplomats from around the world coming to the United States facing the same sort of racial requirements, and how uneasy that was. So we can essentially see how that may be happening today on some level, right? But we have some people want to ask questions, so let's remind everyone, please introduce yourself, tell us where you're joining us from, and then go ahead, ask your question. So
thank you so much for all this explanation, Professor Dunn. I came to the U.S. 20 plus years ago, and I had a scholarship, and this was in Arkansas.
Where are you joining?
I'm sorry.
Where are you joining?
So I'm currently in Salt Lake City, but I'm living in Chicago. So when I went to Arkansas, University of Arkansas, Little Rock, it took me 2 months to realize there was so much racism between my, classmates, and I didn't understand any of it because coming from Europe, I had no access to slavery. We were never taught in high school or secondary education or primary education anything about slavery. So their comments and their discourse was so strange to me. So when I was asking them, why is there so much race and why you're reflecting and why there's so many comments about race, my African American classmates say, oh, you don't worry about it. You're not one of them. And then I was even more puzzled, like, what do you mean I'm not, who should I be? So then they explained, it was this white people from US, who treat us badly. You're not from here. And then I was thinking, but the US people came from Europe. It's almost the same people. So I was even more, confused. So to me, their distinction between white people here and white people somewhere else, like they were making those distinctions in their heads. And it took me so many years, Dr. Dunn, to realize that the difference is, it was after I have read the Hidden Figures book, when I realized what African Americans had to go through, the females. And now since I teach English classes, a lot of my ESL students don't know the cultural differences and the sensitivity when it comes to language, what they need to expose. And oftentimes I have them in my classroom and I say, once we start reading the book, after a few chapters, I say, okay, now, whatever race you think you belong to, go to a separate corner. So I try to divide them in the class to just have them feel like how African Americans felt, because the book really explained how there is signs of colored everywhere. And these, people are constantly, females in NASA were constantly reminded that they're colored, bathroom, fountains, east wing, west wing. It was the segregation and reminder of segregation was constantly present. So I just want to ask you one question. Do you still think that African Americans have different perceptions of different people, where they're categorized that some are more or less of bad people, or they will be treated differently?
I think that there's a sense among African Americans that white people from Europe are not responsible for our current problems.
Okay.
That white people who immigrated to this country, who found it necessary to subject Black people to slavery for their own economic advancement, the historical blame, shall we say, lies at their feet, not at the feet of white people in Europe who never even entered this country. And then if you look at where the worst of it came from in terms of immigrants coming into America from Europe, the worst of it came from the Scot-Irish, who came into this country fairly late compared to the British. And they brought with them, maybe because they came out of a very desperate situation in Europe, a very harsh attitude towards race. And many of the Scot-Irish people settled in the South and brought with them attitudes that really underpinned slavery as it existed in this country. So it wasn't as if the amount of oppression of Black people was equally done by the French or the Spanish. It was mainly white people came from Scotland and Ireland and England itself who brought most of that oppression and racism with them. So yeah, Europeans, I think white Europeans should get a pass from African Americans. I also want to mention the fact that the very concept of race was invented in America. The concept of white, Black, that was invented here in our country because of the necessity to have laws that would allow discrimination against one group as opposed to the other. But before America invented the concept of race, people were merely Spaniards or Frenchmen or Englishmen or African or what have you. Our country designated people to a particular race based upon skin color because of the necessity to reconcile our principle of all men are created equally with the necessity to enslave some people. So race is an American invention.
Yeah.
Do we know, Professor Dunn, what drove their harsh attitude toward a different race, specifically Black people, these immigrants from Europe? What drove their harshness? Did you come?
Part of it was Christianity.
Okay.
Part of it was the sense that anyone who was not a Christian, was a pagan, was a savage, needed to be civilized, particularly Muslims, people who did not believe in Christianity was seen as a threat. So a lot of the perceived need to oppress came from the church. I'm sad to say the church was an instrument of oppression, of racism, and even of enslavement, because the church legitimized slavery. Some people quoted the Bible as a basis for there to be enslavement of other people. So,
so the background of it was actually a religious ideology.
Yes.
Well, not
as I mentioned earlier, about 30% of the enslaved Africans who were brought to America were Muslims, and that had to be changed. That had to be taken away from these people. They had to be forced to be Christians in order to comport with the Christian idea of living.
Yeah. Okay. So look, lots of stuff we touched upon. Slavery was primarily economic endeavor. There were other things they were used to justify, but it was about exploitation and gaining wealth on behalf of some people. And that idea that, that Dr. Dunn discussed, how America particularly kind of brought slavery in a way that it did, where the race was blood-based. It was established to be based on in other words, biological, physical, that nothing you can do about it. Yes, indeed, was quite extraordinary. But we have another question by our guest. Please introduce yourself, tell us where you're joining us from, and go ahead, ask your question.
Yes, thank you very much. I hope I'm audible. My name is Mngobing Gubane, joining in from Nelson Mandela University in South Africa. And I appreciate this space and the discussions and the reference to our country, South Africa, which still has 72% of farmland in South Africa under white ownership, and still has some relations with the US in terms of conservatism in land ownership, especially for Black people in the US. I really appreciate the talk by Dr. Dunn, and also the reference to the squeezing of Black people's land rights in the US. And it actually invokes a film by Gail Myers set in the US. It's called The Rhythms of the Land, and it looks at Black land ownership dispossession in the US. And I specialize in South Africa on land issues, on land politics, on land claims. And in South Africa, I've produced a film called Matonga Elizwe, Spirits of the Land. So what's really vivid for me on my part, based on Dr. Dunn's talk, is that on a world scale, it seems that land is a very big issue, and land ownership and land control is a very big issue, especially when it comes to race and racism, considering what has happened colonially and what is happening on a world scale right now. Thank you very much.
May I make a comment before you go about South Africa? I assume you can still hear. You know, the Trump administration allows white South Africans to come into our country almost unchallenged, but will not allow Black South Africans to come into the country. And the reason the president says that he's doing that is because white South Africans are being suppressed by the Black government in South Africa, and particularly that the white South Africans are losing land at the behest of the government, taking that land and giving it to Blacks. But I don't believe that to be the reality. You know, the current administration of our country has a very racist immigration policy. Let white people in, keep Black and brown people out. And Trump has made the argument that white South Africans are being suppressed, particularly in terms of land ownership, by the Black South African government. I simply don't think that's true. And the gentleman who was just on, I think, reassures me that I am correct about that there's no discrimination to deprive white South Africans of their land. But I'll wait possibly his returning to the program to answer that question for us.
Yeah. Well, it's refreshing to see how we have people joining us from all over the world. Svetlusha was our director, MIRI director Svetlusha. She is in Slovakia, in Bratislava, and she was asking Dr. Dunn about your struggle regarding the Trump Museum in Miami, how far and what's going on with that story, but also do pay attention that many people are not familiar with the details of it. So maybe you can, how you say, enlighten us about what
Right.
story about. The
Yeah.
New York Times have written an article about it and stuff.
Okay. Well, thank you for that question. Miami-Dade College is one of the largest colleges in the country. Located in downtown Miami. It serves primarily minority students, Black and brown students, and it owned a parking lot. It actually owns 3 parking lots, some of those valuable land in downtown Miami. And in recent months, the state of Florida gave that land to the Donald J. Trump Library Foundation. The land is worth at least $67 million, possibly a lot more than that once it gets developed. The state of Florida gave the Trump Library Foundation that land for $10. And the college got nothing. And through a process that was secret. People didn't know about it until after it had happened. So I filed a lawsuit challenging that they had done this illegally violating of Florida's law that requires that these decisions be made with public notice. And a judge agreed and forced them to go back and have another meeting to give the land away. In fact, they did eventually get this land. But I did sue to bring the matter to the public notice that this was happening. So they did, in fact, get the land, but we're still suing them on other grounds. One, that the College Board of Directors did not protect the university from the state. They just gave it away, and that the students got nothing from it. So right now I'm working with a group of students to file a new lawsuit challenging the university for not protecting their right to have that property preserved for their educational future rather than being given to Donald Trump for $10. It was one of the most egregious land giveaway in Florida history. And even if we're not successful with the lawsuit representing the students, we are also going to challenge the president based upon his violation of the Constitution. It's against the law for the president to receive presents, gifts of monetary value while in office. And this transaction involves his breaking the Constitution by accepting his property. So that's, and we're in the process of preparing the second lawsuit as we speak, and it should be filed in a few weeks.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so it's land again.
It's land, exactly, land again.
Land again, yeah. So like,
in fact, you know, what's happening in Miami, and I think it's going all over the country, the most valuable land now in Miami is land in the Black community, where the historic Black community has evolved. Overtown, it's called. That land is inland away from the sea. And with the climate change happening, the ocean is advancing into downtown. So the land in Black Miami is becoming very, very valuable. It's being gentrified, meaning rich white folks are buying it up and pressing the folks who have lived there historically out of that community. So gentrification in this country is yet the whole issue of land coming back to be a problem.
Yeah, there is a documentary made about particularly Liberty City and how things are now basically changing, turning, and how, you know, that land is becoming valuable. Yeah, that's the idea of living space is very strong idea, right? And
yes, indeed.
And you know, it manifests itself you know, in various times, in various ways. Our director
100 years ago in Miami, Black people, even though they lived on properties and houses that they rented, they didn't own them. Everybody had a little yard, a little garden, a fruit tree, a mango tree, but everybody had a little space, a little green space. And as space became more and more limited and became more and more crowded, people started being forced to move into apartment buildings and losing that access to direct contact with the ground and growing and experiencing nature close to them as we have become more and more urbanized. But just upon reflection, that's the part of Black American history, Black Caribbean history. We like having a little land, a little greenery around us. No more. Very expensive to have that these days.
Yeah, because we need a space for great nations to exist, as some famous people have said it. Anyway, we have Camilo and we have our Dr. Surova. So I will ask Camilo, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to express my appreciation. You gave a living space to the thoughts that I have. I wrote a book on racism, which I would like to share with you through Shvetlusha. I would like to thank you, Mirsad, for your chairmanship, for your moderating this. It was a very good impulse dialogue with Marvin, if I may say so. Marvin, you and I are, I think, of the same generation.
Yes, we are. Yeah.
So I would like to be able to. I'm glad to have not only listened to you, but to have met you through this format. And I would like to continue this important, very, very important conversation. And I wish you all the best of luck. I mean, it's a very, very difficult.
Thank you.
But I think many of us around the world are very, very with you. Those of you who are feeling the ruthless power that is pressing on you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. As the Civil War was ending, the federal government reached a temporary agreement, it was not supposed to be temporary, to give each enslaved family, black family, formerly enslaved black family, 4 acres of land and a mule for reparations. And that didn't remain legal for 2 years. Only a few 100,000 acres of land was given to a few black people. So we never got the 4 acres and a mule. As a matter of fact, the reason that didn't happen, the reason that land distribution to the formerly enslaved people did not happen was because of white people in the North who had textile mills, who needed cotton coming from the South just as they needed it before the Civil War. They needed black people back on the plantations, not on 40-acre plots of land growing little plots of cotton. The textile mills needed cotton coming back out of the South. That meant blacks needed to go back to the cotton fields as plantation workers, which is basically what happened. The land went back to the white folks who owned it before the Civil War. Blacks became sharecroppers and were re-enslaved again. So we never got that land, never will get the land, much less the mule. It's one of the sad things about American history that we had a Civil War, and the people who fought the Union, who killed other Americans to try to maintain slavery, ended up getting the land that they owned before the war. As it turned out, more cotton was picked the year after the Civil War ended than was picked the year before it started, meaning blacks went right back to the cotton fields as had been the case before the war started.
Yeah. Okay, so we have to wrap up, but before we have our director, Dr. Svetlusha Sirova. She is to comment and ask questions or perhaps greet her students. We thank you and appreciate your students in the class, and we hope that conversation was interesting for them. Please, Dr. Sirova, join.
Thank you, Mirsad. Hello to everybody. So I'm the director of MIRI, and I would like to express a huge gratitude to Professor Dunn for joining us today and sharing his accounts on very important issues. It was really inspirational, and we learned a lot. So thank you for that. I would like also to thank all the students that were supposed to sit in my class on minority rights, that join us today to hear something new. And also I would like to say thanks to Camilo Antonio, who is my friend along many years, who wrote the book, The Many Phases and Sides of Race, which he asked to share with you later. And before I ask a question, I just opened where he writes what the race is, and he says race is how you and I can kill one another just with our eyes. So Camilo is really not only scientist but also a great poet. So thank that to him. So when I was reading about your life and what you were talking to, I was really impressed to see that when you finished psychology, you started to work like psychologist in the public school, as I understood, and you didn't like it. But what I found very interesting there, and it has something to deal with the segregation in Slovakia. So you were mentioning segregation that was established in the US as a form of law. But in Slovakia today, in 21st century, it's a country that is part of EU, it's a democratic country. We have de facto segregation of Roma children. Roma children attend 3 times more. They are put into the special schools for mentally disabled children. And not because they have mental issues, but because of wrong diagnosis. They are misdiagnosed because they do not speak Slovak language when the tests are done for readiness to primary school. So basically they score very bad, and then they are put into these schools. So So to come back to you, so I found very interesting when you said that you had problems with IQ tests on the Black students.
Yes,
And that you
yes.
establish an academy, and also with the Roma children, they live segregated in the conditions of structural racism, poverty, and so on. Everything what it's familiar to, but they also are at the risk of early dropout from the schools. And it was fascinating to see that you established academy for Black
High school, yes.
and
yes.
that I really would like if you could say, I know that we are running late, but if you can say a few words about that, also maybe to finish on the positive notes. As I always say to Mirsad, please don't finish on bad note. And then last question, mine is also because a lot in MIRI we do a lot of things, not only research and education, which we do most for pro bono. We also fight with the institution, filing complaints all the time, but we are not so mature as you are. But we are, Mirsad and I, we are also children of war coming from Serbia or running away from ex-Yugoslavia. We were minorities there. And but I don't know, maybe we are also a bit tired or, you know, this kind of work that you have lived experience with discrimination, it makes you tired. So I want to ask you, what gives you motivation to continuously fight for justice and truth, as you say, you know, where you find the strength? Thank you very much.
I find it in students. I find it in those young eyes when they open their eyes a little wider when you teach them something they didn't know. You can tell when you reach a student and they appreciate that they learned something new. And as long as I can get that wonderful response from students, just the glow in their eyes when you're teaching them something, I'll keep doing it. The academy, the Dr. Marvin Dunn Academy for Community Education was established by me and two other people over 40 years ago because so many Black students were dropping out of school. So we formulated how we approached education. We had much smaller classrooms, had different rules for the students to participate, requirements for parents to be a part of it. And we lowered the dropout rate, at least among our students, very substantially by doing that. So that school still exists today, and I'm very proud of that. But if I have a moment about being a psychologist in the school system, I really couldn't stand it. I was not able to perform that work. Giving IQ tests to Black students was just punishing for them. I'll give you just one example. One question that psychologists ask students for on one of the intelligence tests is, what is the thing to do if your mother sends you to the store to get a loaf of bread and the grocer says he doesn't have any? What should you do? Well, if the student says, go to another store, he gets 3 points. If the student says, go back home, he gets 0. But Black parents taught their kids, if I send you to the store to get something, you come straight back home. Don't go wandering around to another store to try to find. You come back home. It's dangerous. So the student loses that point by responding to his cultural teaching as opposed to what the test requires him to say. That's just one example of the disconnect between culture, race, and IQ tests that made it very difficult for me to give these tests to kids, and which is why I went to academia rather than remaining a school psychologist. Couldn't stand it. But thank you for the question. I can see the connection too, as you pointed out, between what's happening in your country and what has happened here in our own education system.
Well, thank you, Dr. Dunn. Thank you. That's the positive note. I find inspiration same way in the young people when you see them, you know, getting something, learning something, opening their eyes finally to whatever they are interested in. That kind of takes you very, very far. And
It's when they put the cell phones down. When they put the cell phones on the desk, then you know they're paying attention.
They don't have that option. They will complain to you if they ever see you. They will complain that I don't allow cell phones in the classroom. But anyways, it is rewarding to see the young people today are interested to learn. They want to learn, and they understand things perhaps more than we did when we were young people. And with that, I will we'll have to finish at this point, and we will be back with new and interesting discussions. Please follow us on YouTube. You know, there are lots of interesting conversations there, and sign in for our newsletter so you can get informed about the future events. We are trying hard to continue our mission and working and advocating for the minorities and minority rights. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today, and we see you soon.
Thank you.